welcome our guest, Josh Kaufmann, Multimedia Support Specialist with Tufts University. We have our friend Joe Wade, Director of Learning Environments at the University of Southern California. We have Josh Srago, Juris Doctor Candidate at the Santa Clara University School of Law. And we have Mike Pedersen, Audiovisual Experience Manager at Iowa State University. Thank you all for joining today.
Hey, thanks for inviting us. It's great to be here.
We have a lot to talk about. So the whole world has decided it wants to do distance learning now, and I want to ask you about that. I want to get your ideas about that and see if we can give some counsel to our friends who are participating in the event. So we're going to probably do somewhat of a round robin. I'll ask a question to one of you first, and then it'll be fair game to open up and we can talk about it, and then I'll throw the next question out. The first one is, there is this question regarding what is distance learning today? What does that encompass? Because the definition itself is changing. So Joe, I'm going to throw this one to you. Could you just give our audience a quick overview of sort of what is distance learning and what's all involved with it?
Who wants to go first? I guess I'll dive in.
All right, go for it.
So, one of the challenges with distance learning right now is how we're defining it, and so that's kind of what we're here. That's what we're here to do. So, what I would like to start by saying is what distance learning is not, and distance learning is not what we did a lot of in the spring. We were laughing and we were referring to what we did in the spring. In many cases, was remote or emergency remote teaching, right? Or emergency remote learning. It really wasn't a well-developed distance learning. Distance learning is, of course, it's education, at a distance, not in person. To do it really well, though, you really need to think through the pedagogy of how you're putting that class together and making sure that it's designed well for that online experience. And in many cases, we were not doing that well this spring.
Right. We were just happy to be doing anything at all.
Correct.
Yeah. Correct. So, I mean, I think we need to talk about it being multimodal, right? So it's distance learning that's not necessarily synchronous. It could be asynchronous. So Josh, can you help fill in some of the blanks here? What are we talking about?
So what we're talking about really is that when we talk about traditional education, we're talking about, this traditional, you go to a classroom, you sit there, you listen to a lecture, maybe you interact somewhat with the instructor. The advantage of online learning and what really needs to be tapped in order to make online learning something that is not just an emergency situation, but something that's palatable for a lot of people, the parents, the students, the administrators, is the other ways that distance learning can work. And we can have anywhere from being, you no longer have to go at a specific time, the lectures are pre-recorded. You have the option of going, let's say, for a synchronous session, but if you can't make it to a synchronous session, you can watch the recording. You can learn by watching that. You can listen to the audio files. You can, go over the materials that are presented. And that comes to looking at education as more than just the traditional, as they call it, sage on the stage learning. And that really does, I think that is going to be where we're going to have to go, not just in this distance learning situation, but as we take advantage of what we've learned now for how we can reshape learning as we return after COVID.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Joe, we had a conversation, great panel discussion just the other day on higher education after COVID-19. And you had mentioned that mainly we went video conferencing at USC to get started, and you were able to kind of rapidly roll out Zoom and get everyone online almost overnight. What are your thoughts now on what the next step looks like?
Yeah, it's interesting. I like the word that Josh just used, palatable. That was good. But let's go even a step further than palatable. Let's talk about effective, right? How effective was the transition to online? Okay, it saved the semester, but okay, all grace is now gone, right? Now we have to actually deliver, which is why we're doing 250 room upgrade of Zoom rooms everywhere so we can create the hybrid look. We are in Los Angeles. We know that our whatever is the social distancing and all of those health standards will probably last to be raised, right? So we're going to have to be very conservative with what we do. But also we're looking into every single option that we can physically, but then also bringing in a ton of instructional designers in order to help the faculty at the same time. Because again, and I know we've beat this down a ton of times, lecturing to a webcam is not actually teaching, right? That's one directional, and now we need to be bi-directional. We need to be able to get that feedback back. We need to be able to have the faculty members interact, or at least the TAs interact. So what we're doing is looking at how we can utilize our spaces. Like, for example, taking a group study room, you throw an integrated camera Zoom display in that room. You could actually now have the faculty member just live stream their class from there, have breakout rooms and discussions with the TAs, and start to look at how we can get the communication back, to the students. So it becomes, as you said, kind of multimodal, right? It becomes looking at how we can recreate the on-prem experience in an online environment, while also then being a hybrid environment. And that's why I've said this, that I feel really bad for any faculty member right now. Okay, because especially if you look at the R1 institutions, where you get people who've been on tenure for 30 years. They're still using the same methods. They know what they teach. They have it down. Never wanted to teach online. Never thought they would teach online. All of a sudden, they're being told to teach online. Now, there's been great adoption to do that because thankfully they've recognized the need. But now we're bringing them back on campus. We're going to give them new technology. And, oh, by the way, you know how you were doing traditional and then you were doing online? Well, now we're going to show you something called hybrid. And we're going to teach you another way to teach. I would not want to be that faculty member. But thankfully, so far, we've seen great adoption and at least a desire to learn and listen and collaborate.
Well, and not only are we going to make you teach hybrid now, but we're going to judge you based on whether or not your students really love the way you teach virtually, right? So there's this whole nother dimension. Before, we were just thankful that you were brilliant and you had a lot of really insightful things to share with the students. Now it's how camera ready are you? How well do you project? How well do you remember the fact that you're not supposed to pace in and out of the field of view? So actually, we're going to pivot here because this is a good segue into the next conversation about what do we need to do then to make our distance learning content palatable, right? So focusing on the production value. How can we, what are some suggestions that we can kind of up our game, since the Zoom call hasn't been the most incredible experience I think most of us have received. So I'm going to start this one off with Josh.
Which Josh?
Yeah, again.
You, Josh Srago.
Well, I will start this as the only student in this room right now.
That's right.
It's a couple. Listening to my industry colleagues, it's interesting because the concerns that change, the concerns and how they change. Like Josh's point about being able to flip the classroom and being able to view these asynchronously, have these recorded videos. There's value in that, but there's also restrictions because and I'm using law schools as an example. The American Bar Association has attendance requirements. So how do you confirm whether or not the student has actually done what they needed to do? How do you register that? How do you log that data? And going to very much to Joe's point of some professors don't want to learn this stuff. They have no interest in learning this stuff. They're struggling with it. So creating what I've seen some professors starting to do is incorporating the tools as best they can. It requires a lot of self work effectively. Like they have to put in the time to learn how to do these things. But I've seen breakout rooms getting used effectively for small group environments. Polls are starting to get used. I've also had some professors, what they started using was outside tools. So Zoom became literally just a room you existed in to have a conversation. But then they were using other online web tools in order to conduct polls, conduct surveys. The most interesting one, and I think the most successful class I've been in so far, has two professors in it. And they have one professor that is effectively giving the lecture, and they have a dialogue between that professor, and the other professor, and the other professor is effectively constantly throwing out questions to you to get you to engage in chat. And so effectively you have one person monitoring the chat to be able to force that dialogue and invite you to talk back if you want, because then if you raise a point in chat And law school, of course, Socratic Method. So it's like, oh, well, I'm going to raise a very brief point. Hey, now you're going to have to talk, and now you're going to have to elaborate. It's the problem that you face is this is a small class. It's only like 20 people. How do you do that in a class for 70? How do you do that in a class for 300? And that's where the struggle gets, is the bigger the class gets, it gets a lot harder. So do you start offering more small classes, which then becomes a faculty restriction? Or do you start to figure out how to tailor that? And those are some of the methods that I've seen thus far that have been successful. Because I've had other professors where they haven't changed. Who they are is like they don't use a projector in class. They don't use PowerPoint. They use nothing. They lecture at you for 75 minutes straight. And or they force you to recite back what you read, and it gets into a dialogue, but there's no multimedia. And they continued that into the next semester once we went online. And while they themselves are an engaging professor and in class, it's amazing. Once you're online, there's distractions nonstop everywhere around you. And on top of that, you're not in an actual classroom environment. Some students are on their beds. Some students are in their dining room. I'm fortunate. Like I have a place to go in my house. So how are they learning and how you're engaging with the students is very different. It's going to be very different. And one of the things that I think the schools really need to take notice of and do is get a survey of what kind of an environment they're teaching to. Because if you have students that don't have spaces dedicated to this or don't have any availability of anything, you need to know what kind of environment they're learning in, number one. Number two, you also need to know what access they have. I have classmates that are still on DSL and they live in the Sacramento area. And it's like, do you actually have a broadband connection to support the video? Is the reason you don't have one because it's not available, or is the reason because you can't afford one? Which way is it going here? Mm-hmm. How can we support that connection so that way you can either be synchronous, or we have to make sure that we place you in asynchronous learning environments so that way you can get the videos in the best way that's available for you, because it's about providing that value to the student.
I have to stop you because you just lit up like a bottle rocket. So many cool things just came out of what you shared, like at least 3 that are like major aha moments. The first of which is the relation to, why aren't we doing interviews for instruction? You're right. You know, we wanted to do this event and we were like, do we do presentations? And presentations are boring. This kind of me just disseminating information. So we said, I know, let's do conversations instead. And it's like, well, that's so much more engaging, but I never thought about that. Why can't a professor just interview the TA, or the TA interview the professor and just talk? That'd be engaging. I'll listen to that in a podcast format.
But I think, it's a good point, because we're noticing the same thing exactly as Josh mentioned, of faculty members who have moved and transitioned from, okay, how do I get this to work and create my account, to how can I utilize other tools? Or I heard another faculty member said they did this, they used a poll, or they were able to do a breakout room. So the questions we're getting are actually starting to change, which is encouraging. But exactly that, we're noticing that as we take as we try to figure out how to use our spaces, right, more effectively, we're recognizing that, hey, if it is a large lecture, it's likely not it's likely not interactive, but we can create a ton of Brady Bunch, 3x3 breakout groups and discussion groups, and hold those virtually, right? Because now we don't need the classroom after hours. We can put those other things that need to meet in person in there, and start to get that. And I've already heard that, like, our request for TAs or GAs is going up tremendously this year in order to be able to accommodate exactly what Josh was saying. How can we continue to create that conversation? And I've heard faculty members say, hey, now guess what? They can even jump around those and jump into that class because they'll know when it is, and they'll have the Zoom link to be able to step into that discussion group. So it's interesting how these, like Josh said, these third-party tools and these ways to become more effective in this, the faculty members are starting to think, I'm going to get a little scared when they show up in August if they don't let us know ahead of time what they're going to try to do, and they show up to a room and go, hey, I found this little box at Radio Shack, and I think it's going to be great. Yeah. Can I use this? So I'm going to pick up the other part that Josh shared and ask Mike Pedersen this one. So we mentioned about, well, what about rural internet access? And
And because, Mike and I, we're in the middle of the country. He's in Iowa, I'm in Minnesota. So definitely different on the coast. I don't have, Google Fiber. That said, what kind of modality makes the most sense there? I mean, is live streaming even attractive if you've got a bad internet connection? Should we be focusing on demand video content? So that's one question I'm throwing at you, Mike. The second question I'm throwing at you is, and then also, how do we help the teachers move along? Because it wasn't so bad when they were sitting at their desk at their home in the front of their laptop with a web camera. Then we're going to throw them in a room with a lot of students, maybe even now 10 other panelists on the stage, and they're going to have to learn that. How do we help them? So the two, rural internet, and how do we help faculty teach in a new way?
Yeah, no, certainly here in Iowa, here at Iowa State University, we've had a lot of conversations about, equity and accessibility, and making sure, especially in the more rural areas, one of the things that we're working really hard to do is to survey every student and make sure that we understand what their capabilities are. I know we're exploring potentially, increasing some technology scholarships, specifically, for students to maybe improve some of their connectivity if it's even available to them. Perhaps, on that light. So it's a very serious conversation for us, because we do have, very remote students potentially who have very limited access. And you are correct. I mean, in those situations, an asynchronous model, for those of us, we're throwing some terms out. Asynchronous is basically not in real time. So you're kind of pre-recording the session, and the students can watch it like a YouTube video later on at their own pace and at their own leisure. That might work out better for someone who is, has a slower internet connection than synchronous, which is kind of real time. The Zoom, the real time interaction. That's a much harder use case for bandwidth, and so we're having to be very careful with that. So, to the second part of your question, as far as how do we help the instructors? I think almost every university has some department. We call ours the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, and I think almost every college has some group like that is essentially the instructors for the instructors, right? This is the group that helps teach and educate the professors and the instructors on how to improve their teaching capabilities. And again, ours is ramped into high gear on that. They're teaching classes on how to really optimize the online experience from a teaching perspective. And I suspect that a lot of most other schools, that group is doing that for their school as well. And so we really are leaning heavily on the instructional designers, to help guide our instructors through that process.
Awesome. So that's kind of a follow-up. I mean, where this conversation's flowing, I'm going to ask Josh Kaufmann about, okay, we should improve the quality of our content. We should train the teachers. We could train the teachers, but do we have to train? And do we have to improve the quality? And so I'm going to ask a little bit about the scenario of sort of competing for enrollment. A lot of schools are seeing volatility right now. Their enrollment is totally in flux. And there's been some commenting that larger universities are going to become a little bit more predatory, and they're going to start going after trying to, backfill their missing students by expanding their online reach. Smaller schools are saying, hey, if we're all going to be on Zoom, I've got the same thing to offer you as the bigger school. Do you think that there's going to be any increased competition for student interest if everything's streaming online? And if so, do you think schools need to try and prepare themselves that they now are being compared with other online curriculums that are available?
I think there's no question that no matter where your school falls in the kind of tier, pantheon of colleges in this country, that there is going to be increased competition. We're going to see schools that, depending on how they did in these last few months, their students not knowing the difference between what we've just been through and what true online education is, are going to be looking and saying, hey, wait, my friend who went to school A had this experience, and my experience here was better or worse, whatever. The students talk. These social media, the ability for students to connect with each other is there. I'm in Boston. We have, more than 30 colleges in the Boston area itself. And just those students alone talking to each other are going to be saying, hey, my school did this better. My school did this worse. They're aware of how the different schools are doing it. So they're going to be looking at it and saying, hey, maybe if I went to this school, and we are having to be online, it would be better for me. I would have a better experience. Maybe if I go, if I could take even just a class at this school, it would be better. And I think that really speaks to there will be increased competition, but there also needs to be increased collaboration between the schools. And schools need to be, in a way, reevaluating their transfer credit policies, reevaluating their policies on what students can do outside their traditional ecosystem, because we do have that kind of very cloistered, if you come to my school, you attend my school. You don't attend the other school.
That's right.
And out in Western Mass, in Amherst, the 5 colleges system has been doing this for years, where a student enrolls at UMass Amherst, for example, they can take classes at any of the schools in this 5 college system for credit, and ditto and reciprocal for the other schools in that system. I think we're going to have to see more of that. We're going to have to see more of these collaborations between educational institutions in order to take the most advantage of this. And just before I move on, I just want to go back also to the question you asked Mike about, access to the internet, because that's not just a rural versus urban issue. When we look at, I'm in Boston, again, I'm in Massachusetts, we have a very high-end technological infrastructure here, but we're looking at, K-12 is the example that I have here because it was in the local papers. We had faculty who weren't able to afford a fast enough internet connection to be teaching on Zoom. We have students that are not necessarily able to have access to Zoom. They're not necessarily they don't necessarily have a computer in the home, so they're using their phone for access. And I think that really speaks to one of the things that I've been pushing for even before all this with universal access and universal design, that we need to be looking at as a holistic response. How do we make it accessible to all of our students, even if they're not on campus? It's not just a matter of do they have the bandwidth. It's a matter of, is it accessible to them? Yeah. And I just, want to drop that in there.
So good. So many good points. Mm-hmm. So we're rounding out our time here. I just want to give each of you a chance. Any closing remarks or anything you want to counsel our audience on, just some ideas or things to pay attention to? How about 30 seconds each? We'll go down the line. We'll start with Mike Pedersen. Anything else you can share with our friends?
No, I mean, I guess, again, just the things I would say is it's more than a technology issue. So you really need to be working with the instructional folks to make sure that you're not putting technology in there that no professor wants to use or knows how to use or is not going to blend well with the pedagogy that they're trying to produce. And so it's more than just a pure technology piece. As you're trying to put this together, you really need to be focused on how the education is going to be done.
Fantastic. Josh, Srago.
My best advice is don't be passive. You have 2 communities that you're working with here. You have the students and you have the faculty. Each of them has different needs. Each of them has different problems. Each of them has different situations that they're facing. Engaging them as best you can, putting out surveys, finding out what they want, finding out how you can best be a resource to them is going to take you miles and miles farther than saying, I'm going to upgrade my rooms arbitrarily. Because if they're not allowed back on campus, the room won't do any good. So how can you best provide those resources? Is it Wi-Fi? Is it hotspots from cell providers in order to make sure that they have access in their homes? Is it things like that in order to get them those resources? So engage spend the time. Now is the best time to do it. Engage with your audiences.
Fantastic, Mr. Way, Dr. Way.
No, remember, I'll only make people I don't like call me doctor.
Oh, okay. So, can I call you Joe now?
So doctor like it is for you. No, just kidding. No, the advice, you only give 30 seconds for me to give advice. Oh boy.
Yeah,
all right.
I gotta keep it, can't be all day event.
I think it just comes down to remembering our purpose, right? Why do we do this? Especially for those of us in higher ed, right? There's so many different verticals that we could be in, but we choose to be in one that's based around service. You could say that about House of Worship as well, or even if you're in the entertainment side or hospitality. Just remember the people that our technology and our processes are there to benefit, right? I will say, and I think a lot of my colleagues will agree, that this has been the most difficult 3 months of my life and my professional career. just trying to navigate getting people up onto online, getting them back on campus. It's been hard. It sucked, being honest. I mean, like, it does, but because it's tough. We're trying to navigate new things that we haven't done before. And because you care about the students and you care about why you're doing this, it can weigh on you. So, but remember that. Remember why we're doing it. Remember the purpose behind it, and allow that to inform the decisions we make, both in technology and as well as kind of the processes and working with our faculty and all that. And if we keep that at the heart of it, then I think we're going to be successful.
Fantastic. And Mr. Kaufmann.
I think, I couldn't have said it better than what these three guys have already said. But the other point that I want to make is listen to the faculty, listen to the instructional design teams, and listen to the students. Because when I think about classes, when I think about who I'm working with, I don't think of them as, oh, these are faculty. These are my clients. These are the people that my goal is to assist. And it doesn't matter to me if it's a freshman or if it's the department head with a tenured chair. That's the person who my goal is to help do their best, however that they define that. And so listen to them, listen to what they need, look at the social media channels that our students are using, that are expressing what their views are, so that we get that kind of in-depth look at what they're believing, and then listen to our instructional designers and get them on board with these same channels where we're seeing what students and faculty are saying when they aren't saying it to us.
Fantastic. What a supercharged conversation. 30 minutes of just pure insight on distance learning, guys. I really, really enjoyed being here with you. Thank you so much. And for those who are at the event, I've got some other things coming up for you here at 1 o'clock Eastern. I invite you to join how to use social media to promote your company's offerings and influence your target markets. That can also be in universities, right? How to engage those students on the social media platforms that they're using. And that's going to be with Chris Netto, Paul Richards, Melody Craigmile, and hosted by Tim Albright. We also are going to have on the education stage coming up, mistakes to avoid when deploying and managing lecture capture solutions. That will be with Michael Dannenberg. That will also include Andy Bortz, Randy Tritz from Shen, Nelson, and Wilkie, and also Mike Rich, Vice President of Business Development with Panopto. And then on the business stage, we're going to be talking about mistakes to avoid when designing post-COVID-19 meeting spaces with Michael Goldman, Principal at Communications Design Associates, our friend Josh Srago, and also we'll have Marta Scopa. Thank you so much for tuning in. We really enjoyed having you, and stay tuned for more great content coming up from VCX Conference.